in the current decade, it's clear that this is not a time for people to sign up to really tight new nitrates directive-like measures. It's just not likely to happen. But if there are measures that people can make a commitment to that are positive, that are not difficult, and can show the way forward, well, maybe that's actually a realistic possibility. So I'm going to tell you something about the nitrogen budget for Scotland, but I'm going to put it in a much wider context and tell you why we've got there, how we've got there, and that will help you understand where we're coming from at the same time. So I think our starting point was this thing called the European Nitrogen Assessment. We took 5 years from about 2006 to 2011 to produce it, and it was the first time we started collecting the evidence from across the whole of the nitrogen cycle, in this case at a European scale, air, land, water, ecosystems, farming, energy generation. How do these all fit together in a bigger picture? And that was a critical change from us, from each typically working in our own private areas of science to joining up. That, funnily enough, led to a large amount of press, which is great. And here we are. You can get the summary on YouTube, where we tried to learn to communicate to the world, and you get 600 pages condensed into 4 minutes with music. So I encourage you to go to YouTube if you've not seen that video. So let's just very briefly recap some of our thinking and our objectives in that, if I can get this to work. So we wanted to review the scientific evidence, put things together, the impacts and interactions, and take account of the policies as a basis to inform the development of future policies. Now actually that set of 3 bullets is very interesting, because they seem to come back to us as being just about the same bullets that help us when we're talking about a nitrogen budget. So we collected evidence. There are maps being done. These are maps of nitrogen oxides emissions from traffic. This one is ammonia emissions primarily from agriculture. This one, nitrous oxide emissions, the major greenhouse gas, and inputs to aquatic systems. Now that kind of evidence is vital as it stands, and the maps are pretty, but you've got to go beyond that in order to start making it useful. So what we were interested in here, for example, was issues of source apportionment between sewage, agriculture, industry. What's the relative roles being played by each, and the different country roles. But this is when we start needing to link it up. And this cascade picture will come back several times, where we've got our different nitrogen losses into the environment, the nitrous oxide, greenhouse gas, nitrogen oxides in air pollution, particulate matter formation, ammonia, again particles, leach nitrate out the bottom, and we've got agriculture sources, combustion sources, and then the cascade starts continuing. My clicker's not quite clicking, but to have agricultural livestock sources, things start reacting, and then the system starts further emitting as the nitrogen starts moving through the environment until it's ultimately denitrified to N2. So we've got this cascade system with multiplying nitrogen impacts complexity, and what we need to do is find a way of unpacking the pieces of that in a way that's not too complicated. And if you think that diagram is complicated, this is of course the simplified version. You can imagine 100 other reactions. So we've got a challenge with nitrogen to recognize complexity, but to pull out the main elements so that we can guide ourselves with a clear path through the forest. And one of the ways we did that, firstly, was identifying the why care about nitrogen into 5 reasons. We started with 20 reasons, got it down then to 9 reasons, and finally boiled it to 5. And funnily enough, you find out that these are all the issues we care about normally anyway. And you can add in food security, of course, into that. So wages of too much nitrogen. Now let's, if my clicker will click, I'm not sure whether I should point this, just to show a few favourite impacts, and I will show this slide because it's so exciting as a biologist to see the transformation of a system rich in epiphytes in an Irish woodland to thick, gloopy slime. And the most amazing thing about this was I was there with 5 conservation officers, environment protection officers, and they said, what's the problem? We see that all the time. To which my message is, well, you shouldn't guys be seeing that all the time. Northern Ireland is actually nitrogen land. And of course, there's 100 things in the middle. The really even more interesting news as of this year is that the source of that pollution has stopped for various regulatory and prosecution reasons. So 6 years later, we're now seeing huge recovery on the site, which also tells us if you take action, you're going to see the impact, which is really exciting. Now, to our first European nitrogen budget. And Uli's going to tell you a lot more about how you get into the parts of this. But what you see with this is the different parts of the story coming together. So we've got here what looks like a small arrow in the top left, where it says 6 and 4. That's the combustion sources. So they're straight out into the atmosphere, but a small part of the overall flow. So they're important because they're going straight into the atmosphere. Agriculture is dominating the entire nitrogen budget of Europe. So these fertilizer flows coming in, these are in million tons, going to crop production, to livestock farming with recycling back to the soils. That's what we planned, and the yellow is everything that was unplanned. So you can see there's just nitrogen going everywhere, up into the air, down to the soil. The buttons then, which are numbered, become the places we can take action. And the size of these numbers are giving us a guide on the priorities of where we should be taking action. So there's some interesting things. So of course, we've got a huge opportunity in crop production to reduce our nitrogen losses. That's where the biggest flows are. And similarly, livestock farming, improving livestock nitrogen use efficiency, feed conversion efficiency, improving manure return to the soil. But it's not only that, but it's for everybody to take action, for wastewater treatment, for issues to do with NOx combustion. And actually, the one I find really exciting, this one always, is our food choice. So, amazingly, of all this crop production, 85% is going to feed livestock. 15% in Europe is going to feed people. And that's because we've got grassland feeding animals directly, we've got crops feeding pigs and turkeys, etc. And in the overall system, really, this is a case of we're running the European nitrogen for livestock feed security rather than for human food security. So that means that this choice of what's the right amount of meat to eat is a really interesting one, because you can massively affect the efficiency of the overall system and, of course, the pollution associated with it. Very quickly to say, once we've got these numbers in a budget, we can start applying them to ask some interesting extra questions like, what is going to be the societal impact? And here we had a shot at valuing the total damage cost in Europe of nitrogen pollution. So your budget, nitrogen budget, having got it, can go for these other purposes. In this case, we estimated at 70 to 320 billion euro a year worth of pollution. Now, that's really difficult numbers to value, and we can discuss about that and come back to it later, but it's showing how you can then apply and find these things to be useful. I'm going to skip this, if my clicker clicks, quickly to build up the picture for the world nitrogen cycle. And here we are with a budget of all our different sources, again with numbers on them, and again providing an opportunity of where to take action in all of these. And we've summarized that, so I'm not going to spend too much time with that last one. I'm going to summarize that into this next diagram. Here's our attempted simplest version of looking at the nitrogen cycle and what you would extract out of the nitrogen budget and say, where would you take action? So every one of those numbers is a place for taking action. Taking action in improving the nitrogen use efficiency of crops, improving it for nitrogen in animals, improving the nitrogen supply chains and issues about food waste. Of course, those will all propagate up to improving the efficiency. I mentioned already our food choices. That's the motor that drives the system and affects efficiency, and then recapturing the sewage, recapturing the manures. And not to forget at the bottom, this atmospheric NOx coming up into the atmosphere. The really interesting thing when I drew this diagram was to suddenly ask myself, this bottom line, how much are we capturing from this? And the answer was almost none. Because of course all our current technologies to manage NOx from combustion focus on denitrification. Your catalytic converter takes NOx, a reactive form of nitrogen, and converts it to N2, which is pure atmospheric nitrogen. So you've taken a resource and destroyed it. So we're now having conversations with various departments about how could we, instead of destroying it, wash it out of a combustion plant, multiply it by €1 per kilogram of nitrogen, and by the value generated, enable ultimately to go further with mitigation solutions by these kind of circular economy thinking than we would have done in the past. So I think that circular economy thinking is critical also for the nitrogen budgets. One of the terms I keep mentioning is nitrogen use efficiency, and that means different things to different people. Essentially, what are you getting in output divided by what are you putting as input? If I put in 10 kilograms of nitrogen, I'd like to have 10 out. But I'm not going to get that because of various losses, denitrification losses to the atmosphere. But at the moment, the number in the full chain is about 20% efficiency. That means there's massive potential for reducing those losses, and the budget can guide us as to where to do that. And just to show a couple of examples of a colleague who's taken, here we go, okay, taken FAO statistics to do this on a national level and shown some really interesting things. And so we see, for example, Germany managing from 1961 to 2009 already to have substantially increased its nitrogen use efficiency. I selected these examples because they're such nice ones. Something interesting happened in Bangladesh as well in the 1990s, which now needs further unpacking to understand how they achieved that. What did that mean? So this comes into ways of analysing the data. Now on to mitigation strategies. What are we actually going to do about it once we've got this information on the flows and where we would go? And my personal angle is to start with ammonia emissions. There's others in here who are experts on nitrous oxide emission, the nitrate leaching. And for the UNECE, we identified the 5 top things you would really do. And number 1 of the things you would really do is have low emission land spreading and low emission fertilizer application, not to be forgotten. Improving animal feeding strategies, which means you're putting a more efficient diet for the animals, covers on slurry stores. And actually, this was interesting because we already mentioned farm nitrogen balance. Just like a Scottish nitrogen budget, it doesn't actually change emissions. But what it does do is it makes you aware of where you are and where your opportunities, so you will start wanting to do it yourself. And then, for example, putting in a plan of covered manure storage so that your manure is even better than it would have been before, and then applying it to the land as effectively as you can, is going to give you the leading opportunities. At the bottom of the list was the low-emission housing systems, because that tends to be more expensive. And out of that, delivering guidance for the UNECE, including the latest document, this framework code, which is the basis for every country's national code of good practice. And by the way, out of the 25 or so countries that have ratified and committed to this in the UNECE, only about 5 or so have delivered these. And as far as I know, there isn't, for example, a Scottish ammonia code. You can look and find out if you can find one. But I'm not aware of such. You'll say it's embedded into the PEPFAR codes for Scotland. But then one could also ask, how recently was that updated? Now, it's just to show the favourite one, the splash plate spreaders, the old technology, going towards trailing hoses as a cheap but cheerful new method, and trailing shoe, where it actually goes under the grass, just on top of the soil surface, and the slot injector, where you get it actually into the soil. Interesting enough, in Denmark and the Netherlands, they required this one, in fact, and said the others are not ambitious enough. The Netherlands committed to that in 1993, Denmark in about 2000. And of course, the rest of us are trailing behind like the trailing shoe. Denmark has even gone a step further and said, for farmers that don't want to do slot injection, they'll now give a special exemption if you add acid to the front of a trailing hose. So there's a guy out there now running his own business, selling acid delivery systems to farmers as he would argue, a more cost-effective way. So it's generating innovation. That's my message. Once you go to this game, it's not just a negative, there's actually positive innovation opportunities. And another farmer who's got a very large farm, several thousand hectares, but tells me he's saving £70,000 a year on his fertiliser bill now, because he's got a covered manure storage combined with low-emission manure application. Of course, he had to invest in it, but there'll be a payback time after that. Not to forget the fertilisers. And interesting thing with this, these are trials actually put in place by BASF, testing their Limus product, and there's other products out there, that reduces the conversion rate from urea fertiliser to ammonia, thereby reducing emissions, getting more into the plant. Interestingly, since 2017, Germany in its Dungerverordnung, and apologies if I've got the spelling wrong to German speakers, requires, if using urea, low emission practices will be used, and that either means incorporation or fertilizer inhibitors to be used. So that's actually, I would say, the big European decision of the year on fertilizers for nitrogen. Now, I think we can have a wider discussion on how to optimize best the N2O emissions, how to optimize best the nitrate leaching. But the philosophy is keep more in the farming system, therefore allowing you to put less fresh nitrogen in, which means more to the product and a potential saving money all round. And that means not to forget also the denitrification losses. In the past, denitrification to N2, because it's benign, we sort of said, well, we'll ignore that, that's not a problem. But it's a waste of the fertilizer, so you're not getting your full economic benefit. And of course, it's reducing your efficiency of the system. Now, to really come back to money again, and what we can do with these numbers, this is again a European number. We've taken our European nitrogen budget numbers, extracted out the key numbers, because we've got them now, and tell us what are the losses to air, land, and water. So, really interesting. So, this is the losses to air, and it's made up of ammonia, of NOx, of N2O. N2O is quite small. But altogether it's adding in, and the really big term is the denitrification. So if we could be really clever and find a way to reduce denitrification, I think this is a holy grail of soil scientists, perhaps. This is really going to help us improve our efficiency. So that loss is 22 million tonnes, and I'm going to times it not by social costs this time for health and environment, just by the fertiliser price. So multiply it by 80 cents per kilogram of nitrogen, that's 18 billion euro a year. And if we take the agriculture part of that, 14 billion, bear in mind that Europe spends 57 billion a year on the Common Agricultural Policy budget. So that's 25% of the Common Agricultural Policy budget being lost as fertiliser nitrogen value, or 10% of the entire EU budget, depending on which number you prefer. So this is really worthwhile taking seriously. Now, I've talked a lot about agriculture, a bit about combustion, just to mention about food choice, since this is Nourish Scotland event. And this one has also got a lot of attention. We launched this report in the European Parliament and also got a press reaction from the Times, who were a bit cautious but negative. We did use the word Demetarian, invented that. We're not quite the UN, although we were working for them. And if you turn to page 26 in a hidden paragraph, you can see a comment on raising taxes. But with all those caveats, it's getting the message out about it's not just about farming, it's about citizens' choices, about how much meat we choose to eat. Demetarian, meaning half meat consumption. And it gets a conversation going. And so I was extremely pleased, and I'm going to show these numbers, improving pollution efficiency by a factor of 2, from 22 to 44%. That's in our nitrogen budget. So we've doubled efficiency of the system. We've reduced pollution by 40%. And we've got a social response. So I really want a social response. I want the world to be talking about nitrogen. Here we are. We've got into the book you can have for your friends for Christmas called Etymology, where you find Demetarian immediately after crop swap and coming before drunkorexia. Drunkorexia is where you try to get all of your calories from alcohol. Anyway, but in that environment, here we find Demetarian, and Demetarian tells us about the Barsac Declaration, a commitment by scientists to optimize meat consumption in their conferences. It tells you about our report, Nitrogen on the Table, with the key facts, and you can read it and get it in your Christmas stocking. So this is great that we're talking about nitrogen, and it's coming, actually, funnily enough, it's all coming out of our start to look at the nitrogen budget. It's a cascade, another nitrogen cascade. So let's talk about change now, building the case for change. And here you asked me to talk about whether regulation or economic incentives or whatever is the right approach. And I think that's probably a question for discussion rather than me telling you. Because, of course, we know we've got so many issues in that environment of trade-offs. But what I think I should emphasize is, let's just summarize, what are the benefits of a nitrogen budget approach? It's giving the perspectives for priorities. Should we care about one number, should we care about another? From a nitrogen budget perspective, we shouldn't really care about N2O too much. Sorry, Dave. But I would argue, and the soil scientists can disagree with this, that there's probably a high degree of coupling between the N2O loss and the dinitrogen loss, because they're both denitrification related. If you get one down, you've probably got a good chance of getting the other down. So you get climate and nitrogen efficiency at the same time, as long as we consider both of them. The wages number, that was the acronym for the multiple impacts: water, air, greenhouse, ecosystem, soils. Win-wins for environment, food, energy security. The efficiency, I think, is a positive approach. The regulation in the past, I think, is often set up this perhaps an unhelpful counter-dynamic between the regulated and the regulators, that everybody feels negative, and that negativity can slow things down. The nitrogen use efficiency, who can disagree with wanting to improve efficiency? You can debate on the definitions, but we all want to improve efficiency. The circular economy perspective, and I think that's critical, where it's allowing the efficiency debate to be turned into a possibility for innovation. I mentioned the Danish farmer who invented his acidification system and is now running a business on that basis. Businesses now, for example, in Italy, driven by the nitrates directive, actually, where they can't put as much fertilizer or manure on the ground because of the nitrates directive. So they pay somebody to take the manure away. The guy that's taking the manure away now has money and manure. It's a great start for a business model. So their anaerobic digestion is getting off the methane that powers the business, and then they're using ammonia stripping technology with membranes and things to degas the ammonia. They put that together with acid, make ammonium sulfate, sell it back to the fertilizer company. So you've actually generated a nice circular economy business solution. And that kind of thing, I think, when you put all these things together, you're addressing the barriers. So let's just think finally about the context in regulatory frameworks, and mention we've got where the low-hanging fruit, what are the natural priorities, policy on our own terms, fertilizer versus limits, what are the major regional differences, where does Scotland? Scotland is a very interesting example of that because of this disjunction between basically the highlands and the mountains and the lowland belt with extreme differences. Some of the cleanest parts of the UK are very large areas and real local hotspots in Scotland, and how we can develop these opportunities. And I think, also critically, the debate will be vital as well. So I think at that point, if you think that's enough, I will stop and open it for questions.